Hello, and welcome to Combat Over Coffee, a bi-monthly 30-minute audio podcast. And I'm your host, Mr. Charles. Well, together we will listen to combat stories told by the veterans themselves. Full disclosure, I'm a 75-year-old man with no podcast experience. In fact, I have no media experience. And when I decided to do this podcast, I did what most people would do. I Googled it. I Googled audio podcasts. And I listened to all kinds of podcasts. Sports, religious, politics, how to bake a cake. It really didn't matter to me because I wasn't interested in the content of the podcast. There were two things I was looking for. One, the format that they used, either amateur like me or a professional. And I was very interested in the voices that were used, both male and female. And the voices were very important to me because I don't think I have a great delivery of words. And I have this pausing problem. Ever since I can remember, even as a kid, I'll be talking to somebody, and out of the blue, I pause for no reason. And it's always been that way. So I wanted to listen to other audio podcasts to see if there were any weird stuff like that with theirs. And some of these podcasts are very slick, and I was very envious because I knew that they were probably produced in a professional studio with professional equipment. And maybe, I don't know for sure, but the secret is they could edit the audio. So if they screwed up, something went wrong, or they paused, they could edit it, put it all back together, and it was very smooth and very professional. And I was envious of that. I thought, how can I do that? Well, the only way to do that is to get yourself a good microphone and a headset and start recording and listen to yourself. Now, I've been told that most people don't like the sound of their own voice. And I had never heard my own voice before. So I was very curious. And the other thing I discovered on these audio podcasts is it sounded like a lot of them were scripted, like a radio show, like they were reading off a script. And I wasn't sure I wanted to do something like that. So the day came when I set everything up for the first time, and I did a test recording on my voice. Surprisingly, I didn't mind the sound of my own voice. I didn't know if it was radio voice, but I didn't mind the sound of it. But of course, after playing it back, I had the pausing, I had the hesitation, and the occasional tripping over my words. I didn't hear that in these other podcasts. So I thought, it's mind over matter. It's simple. I'll do the podcast and I won't pause. So I deleted that audio and I started again. 5-6 minutes. And I already knew it was a disaster. So I played it back. There was no pausing, nothing. But it was horrible. I'm tripping over my own words. I'm saying things I really don't want to say because I'm concentrating too much. So I thought, how am I going to do this? Maybe I shouldn't be doing an audio podcast at all. But the answer is staring me right in the face. You've heard that old saying, you do you. Well, that's what I decided to do. I'm going to do me because I'm just like everybody else. You're just natural. You just talk the way you talk. So I had to come up with a format where I could do me. And what I'm looking for is a casual atmosphere, no intimidation, and kind of relaxed. But I didn't know what that format could possibly be until I decided I actually like going to a coffee shop and talking with friends. Not often, but occasionally I'll meet somebody and we'll talk. And it's just natural. Whatever comes out, comes out. There could be laughter. There could be telling a horrible joke. It could be the F word slips out, giggling. Who knows what's going to happen? Because when two people sit down across from each other, nothing's scripted. I mean, you're not walking into the coffee shop with a bright yellow legal pad with everything written down about what you want to talk about. You just sit down and start talking. So I came up with a coffee shop format. And when I interview a guest, and by the way, the guest may have the same problem as me. They might be pausing and doing all kinds of weird stuff also. But it's natural and it's unscripted. So I decided to do the coffee shop format. And hopefully the guest and I, when we're talking and asking questions and they're talking about their experience, they feel comfortable like they're in a coffee shop. Because after all, I think most people feel safe in a coffee shop. That's why they're so popular. So there'll be two things on this podcast that I'm going to do. One, everything's going to be unscripted. Do I take notes? Absolutely. But I'm not going to sit down and write everything out, try to memorize it. It's the same thing with the guest. And the other thing is, there will be no audio edits. So everything from turning the microphone on to the turning the microphone off, everything in between will be published. Now, in the podcast world, this may be suicide. I really don't know. And I don't know how other people do it. Now, when I listen to some of the amateur, I mean amateur, sitting in your closet doing a podcast, I don't know how those people, what their format is or what they do, but I'm going to go with it. Now, I'm not kidding myself. I'm an amateur. And this is why episode 1 is called Amateur Hour. And maybe by the time I get episode 7, 8, or 9, it might be not too bad of a podcast hour. But I'm going to persevere. I'm not going to give up, and I'm going to see it through. So what might my qualifications be to interview combat veterans? Well, let me give you just a quick snapshot of my life. I quit high school and joined the military. And before they let me out of boot camp, they told me I had to pass my GED, which I did. So I got my GED right out of the military and then went and did my service. I did go to 1 year of community college after I got out of the military, only because somebody told me, hey, if you go to the VA on the GI Bill, they'll pay you to go to school. Well, at that point, I'm a very young, newlywed guy, and I needed the money. So I did go to school, junior college, for 1 year. And believe me, if I hadn't been paid to do it, I wouldn't have done it. So obviously, I do not have a bachelor's degree. I do not have a PhD. I'm not a retired admiral or a general or a gunny sergeant. I was just a plain old everyday enlisted guy who did his time and got out. I have not written a successful book. I don't even own a suit and a tie. But I have one qualification for this podcast. In the third week of January 1968, I arrived in South Vietnam. And I spent the next 12 months in the Mekong Delta of South Vietnam. And on New Year's Day, January 1st, 1969, I flew home out of Tan Son Nhut Air Base. So I feel like I'm qualified and I feel comfortable talking to other combat veterans. Now, in my personal experience, and I know a lot of other people, men and women who've been in combat, feel the same way, you really don't want to share stories. And you might go your whole life without saying things or talking about it because it's very personal, and quite frankly, it's nobody's business unless you choose to make it that way. Now, when I got home from Vietnam, my enlistment was up. I did not ship over or re-enlist. And I was naive to think that I could jump right back into the family where I left off. For me, it didn't happen. One of the hardest things for me was to reconnect with my immediate family. And to some degree, it's been that way my whole life. And it's not the family's fault. The family was the same when I got home. It was me. I was different. I had changed. Now, I suppose I could have given a blow-by-blow, minute-by-minute description of my combat, but I chose not to do that. In fact, I just celebrated, my wife and I, our 50th wedding anniversary. God bless her. And it's only been probably the last 10 years that she's heard anything about my experience in Vietnam. And like many people, I tried to bury it. I did not want to look in the rearview mirror, but it didn't work. So my whole life, let me put it this way, combat affected what I did the rest of my life after I got out. So I think I'm more than qualified to listen to stories from combat veterans. So what kind of interviews am I looking for? Who do I want to talk to? Well, number one, I'll give you my impression and definition of combat. I compare combat to an onion. There's many, many layers to an onion. You keep peeling it back and peeling it back and peeling it back. Well, that's the way combat was. There's a lot of layers. Nothing's simple. Nothing's straightforward. And you keep peeling back the layers of combat till you get to the core. And the core of combat for me was the human spirit. And in combat, the human spirit gets wounded. And it may take years or maybe forever to repair that damage to the human spirit. Also, in that core of combat, you'll find the human desire, human emotions, and human memories. And the emotions and the memories start on day one. After you've been in combat, even after one firefight, the memories start and the emotions start. And they may last a day, a week, a couple months, a couple years, but in most cases, the emotions and the memories last forever. And there's also the desire that's in that core of combat. And the desire is to do the best job you've been trained to do. After all, you've been trained to kill other human beings. And that desire was there for me. I wanted to do my job. And it goes back to that old saying, kill or be killed. And this is where the human spirit gets wounded. Because I think for everybody that's ever born, the human spirit is not designed to kill. It may lead to that someday. So that's something you really have to work around in combat. But there's more than just combat stories that I want to talk about. I'd like to talk to people who have the after effects of combat, how it has affected their life and what they've gone through. Now, there is the occasional person who has this experience in combat in any war, doesn't matter when it was. And it's like water off a duck's back. I knew a guy like that, a guy I went to high school with. He was in heavy combat. And he tells me he doesn't even think about it. It was no big deal. I just went on with my life. Well, if that's you, you're a lucky person. And again, it doesn't matter if it's one firefight or 50 firefights. It's something you'll remember. So I'd like to talk to people who want to talk maybe about a unit they were in. And maybe the unit never got any recognition whatsoever. Your unit didn't get a presidential unit citation when you thought you should have got one. Or you want to talk about a particular operation that you were on. And maybe it wasn't successful. Maybe it was successful. That kind of a story. Or maybe it was one single firefight. And there's a story there that you would like to tell. If you've never had a platform and you've been dragging something with you your whole life and you want to get off your chest, this is a platform for you. This is your opportunity. This is a 30-minute podcast. You're going to get a full 25 minutes to talk about what you want to talk about. So there's a million stories out there, and I'm looking for the unusual. You know, there have been Hollywood blockbusters made off of one firefight or one-day operation. And there's probably been thousands of novels written about combat. But for the majority of the time, and the majority of people, your experience in combat never made the history books. Nobody back in the world knew about it. And only if you chose to tell somebody, especially your family, nobody else would know about it. And maybe you want to talk about that. And there's a lot of things in the interview that you might hear and not understand. Now, I just kind of realized in the last couple of years something. I suppose at any podcast, the age group that's listening could be anything from teenagers all the way up to 80 years old or higher. And if you're talking to teenagers or early 20s, and you're trying to tell a story that, let's say, is 10 years old or older, they may have no clue what you're talking about. I mean, at my age, everything in history, I think everybody else knows since I was a young man. Well, that's not true. And there's only a couple examples of maybe, no matter what age group, you know what you're talking about. And that would be maybe talking about Elvis Presley or John Wayne, two American icons. I know that grade school kids today know about Elvis Presley. But for the most part, you're going to lose the audience, a young audience, if you don't explain what you're talking about, especially military jargon. So during my podcast, if there are words pop up, especially military slang, that you don't understand and you're getting lost in the conversation, then the simplest thing to do is to pause the podcast, Google it, and catch up on what we're talking about. So there's terms like FUBAR, SERE, S-E-R-E, C4, Westpac. It goes on and on and on. So if I'm talking about it, I'll try to clarify it. And if my guest is talking about it, we'll try to clarify it. So real quick, let me explain the title, Combat Over Coffee. When I got out of Vietnam, I went on my merry way. And for decades and decades, I just kind of went my own way. But I had always prayed and hoped that I'd run into one other guy that was in my unit. My unit was called the Mobile Riverine Force. And it was a very small group of people, and it only lasted 2.5 years. And I looked, and I didn't search online, being honest, but I was just hoping over the years I'd run into somebody. And it just seemed to never happen. And I guess I wanted to talk to somebody who was there when I was there to validate my experiences. Because after a while, you might think you're making this stuff up, or the dreams you have never really happen. So about 5 years ago, I'm in a fast food joint. I'm waiting in line to order, and there's a guy standing right in front of me. And I'm staring at the back of his ball cap, and big embroidered letters that said Mobile Riverine Force. And I couldn't believe it. I'd never seen anybody wear any gear with the MRF, Mobile Riverine Force. So I tapped the guy on the shoulder. He turned around, and I asked him if he was on the boats. He said he was. I told him I was. He asked me what year. I said 1968. And the next thing I know, this guy's hugging me. And he looks me straight in the eye and he says, I've been looking for you my whole life. Well, that's how I felt. And this weight just kind of lifted from my shoulders. Well, to make a very long story short, we exchanged phone numbers. About a week later, we sit down and we have a 2-hour beautiful conversation about our experience. Turns out Lee was his name. He got to Vietnam 3 weeks after me, and he was in my division, which means for 11 months, we were in the same firefights, same operations. And he did validate things that I thought about, and we talked about all kinds of stuff. And this went on for 3 years. And Lee wasn't my, best friend forever. In fact, we didn't even socialize. But if he was feeling down or I was feeling down, we'd go have coffee and we'd talk. It was better than going to group therapy. I can guarantee you that. And it was just great. I was his go-to guy and he was my go-to guy. And for the 3 years, it was great. And then one day at coffee, he tells me he's not feeling right. There's something wrong. I'm going to go to the VA, see my doctor, and find out what's going on. Well, it turns out that was the beginning of the end for my buddy Lee. And through the effects of Agent Orange, and if you're not familiar with Agent Orange, and that's not an FBI agent's name, Google it. And what happened to Lee, like happened to a lot of veterans like me from the Vietnam War, is Lee ended up with the trifecta: heart, lungs, and kidney. And over an 18-month period, it got worse and worse, and it got worse. I saw him less often because he was either too sick or in the hospital, and he faded quickly. And 24/7 high-flow oxygen he was on. The VA bought him a scooter, but he's too sick to use that. And on May 18th of this year, my buddy Lee passed away. And my combat over coffee came to an end. And I was devastated. Even though I knew it was coming, I was devastated. And this left a big hole, a big, huge void in my life. Because he was my therapy and I was his therapy. And my options were very small. It took me 50 years to find this guy, and I'm 75 now. It ain't going to happen again. I'm not going to find anybody who was there when I was there. And I guess I go back to VA and see the shrink, but they love to fill you up with pills, which I do not take. Or I could go back to group, which I've already expressed my feeling about group. It sucked. And this is when the podcast came to mind. I thought, man, I can't be the only guy that feels this way, the way I feel. So I'm being very selfish here. Even if this podcast doesn't make it, because I have a lot of competition, I realize that. I got to get the word out. Even if I only have 5 people listening a week or per episode. I'm being selfish because this is therapy for me and I'm actually enjoying it. So, how do you get in touch with me? I have a email address that's exclusive to the podcast, and it's brownwaternavy@outlook.com. That's brownwaternavy@outlook.com. And it's good for a couple of things. One, if you're interested in doing an interview for the podcast, just shoot me an email, give me some information, phone number. I'll give you a call. We'll talk about it. If we think we both agree that it'd be a good thing, then we'll go ahead and set up an interview. It's also, the email is good for comments, good and bad. Now, I don't shy away from negativity. Negative comments, I think are a good thing because I can grow from them. And I don't want to be an amateur. I want to do this and I want to be professional about it. I want to respect people who want to have interviews. And even if you weren't in the military, and you're listening to this podcast, keep an open mind, because I think a lot of these interviews will touch your heart. And it's not that we don't respect our veterans, but I know right now, in this day and age in America, there's not many proud Americans left who are proud to serve. And I think the people that sacrificed before you can learn a lot from them. So I guess the only other comment I have to make at this time is I only have one rule on this podcast: no politics. I don't want to talk about politics. If I did, I would have politics over coffee. And quite frankly, I don't give a crap how you feel about politics. And I'm sure you don't feel or you don't care about my politics. So I know it's going to take a lot of episodes before I get my first interview. And I've got episode 2 and 3 lined up, which are going to be examples of the kind of stories I'd love to hear. Now, I have no problem with the blood, guts, and glory stories. That's all part of combat. But I want to try to touch on the human side of combat and how it affects people. And if you're a family member who maybe have lost somebody in combat, I'd love to hear from you too. And we're talking about all spectrum here, from, World War II to Korea, Afghanistan, Vietnam. And the only reason I bring up Vietnam is because that was my generation, that was my war. But I'm not going to get stuck on Vietnam. I want to represent, or have people represent, every conflict that this country's had. And again, I just don't know if everybody is familiar with how the military works. And for me, it was a good thing, even though I had this experience. By the way, I volunteered, and it's still a volunteer military today. And I volunteered for combat. Sometimes you got to be careful what you wish for, because it might come true. But all in all, I'm grateful to the VA. They've been very helpful to me. And I'm grateful to my family who put up with some stuff from me. I go through mood swings still today. And my family doesn't know everything, but they know enough. And I think they'll be a little surprised when they find out I'm doing a podcast, because I haven't told anybody. So if you like it, you can like me on Spotify. And I know Spotify has question and answers available. And you can do polls on Spotify. And I'll do all that stuff. But the email is the quickest way to get a hold of me. And I will try to answer everybody that I can. And again, if you want to make a negative comment, I'm all for it. I have no problem with it. And the other reason I made it amateur hour is because there might be some guy out there that goes, his comment is, this is nothing but amateur hour for this guy. So I took his thunder away. So hopefully in the next 2 weeks, we'll get episode 2 up and running. I'll be busy on social media trying to get the word out. So that it does wrap up episode 1. So I'll see you.